Hello and welcome to the Sustainability Street podcast with Crowbury Consulting. My name is Becky Toll, Managing Director of Crowbury Consulting, and joining me today is Cameron Wilson, Sustainability Legal Executive, also at Crowbury Consulting, who's going to be talking to us all about the circular economy and the waste regulations. So hello to Cameron.
Hi Becky, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, really exciting.
Good stuff, you're welcome. So Cameron, this is quite an interesting subject, circular economy and the waste regulations. So just explain to our listeners how you came to be interested in this subject matter.
So I think where we've got to go to there is, obviously I'm the Sustainability Legal Executive, and the legal part is because I did a law degree. And, I don't really want to mention that too much. That's the only time I mention it. And I think a lot of it comes from when I was in Italy. I just got to as I spent a year there, it was really sort of interesting to see how they deal with their waste and how they sort of deal with recycling, and every single bin has 4 compartments. Every single thing is you get a fine if you're caught not doing it. Whereas I feel like over in the UK, it's usually a lot more relaxed. I know in the office we do separate our waste, but I know a lot of places there aren't, especially out on the street. They've just got one bin, people throw anything in there. And I think that sort of really piqued my interest. And then a big part, I'd say, obviously, then I came to work for Crowbury, and you've taught me a lot from that, and taught me a lot about the circular economy and meeting our clients and compiling legal registers with them. I'd say that it's pretty interesting how the circular economy works in relation to office environments and other environments.
Okay, thank you. No, that's great. And just for sort of definition and sort of explanatory purposes for our listeners, Cameron, could you just explain, what do we actually mean by the phrase circular economy?
So, to be honest, Becky, the idea of the circular economy can't actually be traced back to any single date or any person. It sort of just appeared in the 1970s. And I'd say that, to be honest, I've been looking at loads of different definitions over the past few years. And I'd say the best definition comes from the charity WRAP, Waste and Resource Action Programme. And it's basically that the circular economy is an alternative to the traditional linear economy. So I guess for the listeners, the linear economy is like seeing it as a piece of string. At the start, you've got make. At the end, you've got dispose. So it's make, use, dispose. And that's just keeps going and going and going. Whereas the circular economy is a circle. So the definition states, so for the circular economy, we keep resources in use for as long as possible, extract the maximum value from them whilst in use, then recover and regenerate products and materials at the end of each service life.
Okay.
So it definitely just sort of works on a more cradle to cradle idea as opposed to a cradle to grave. And that's brilliantly theorized by Michael Braungart. And it's basically the idea that all materials going into making the product can be salvaged in some capacity. It's just sort of trusting in that you can find companies who can do that. Okay.
Interesting. So the idea being now that all sort of manufacturers are kind of moving into a circular economy model. And I do remember seeing a recent statistic which said that 3/4 of the energy in manufacturing comes from material extraction.
That's right,
not the actual manufacturing of the products themselves. So if you eliminate that need, you can reduce both your energy consumption and your costs, which are obviously great for the bottom line, but also the triple line in terms of reducing global warming, getting to carbon zero as well, isn't it, Cameron?
Exactly. That's the main thing, is trying to reverse the damage that we've caused as a society, which is not nice to sort of say, but we have, and I think that's got to be completely acknowledged now. And I think that if we do allow the circular economy to sort of take off, it will put businesses in sort of a position, and a much better position when it comes to resource scarcity. I think, when you sort of talk about resources going and everything sort of disappearing, you imagine, I don't know if you've seen the film WALL-E.
Oh, yes.
So the idea that everything, there's just loads of little robots going around collecting
Yeah.
waste and making it into things just to sort of free up space. Whereas really what it's going to come down to is you're going to be running out of oil, prices are going to fly up. You're going to be running out of metal, prices again are going to be flying up. Whereas if you can just recover and, reuse those things, the prices will sort of level out. Of course, there'll be a cost in engaging these companies, but bottom line, in the long term, which I think us at Crowbury Consulting like to say a lot, is you've got to think about the long term.
Yeah.
It's definitely a much better use of waste.
Better proposition. Interesting. So, Cameron, for our listeners who might not be aware of what sustainability is, from a sort of social, economic, and sort of, environmental perspective, would you be able to just sort of touch on, how the circular economy can support those three pillars of sustainability? So the people side, the planet, and then the economic side, if you like.
Yeah, so as we said, obviously there's three legs of sustainability. You've got the environment, the economy, and social sustainability. And as we said, the tripod won't hold up. And I did watch a really great video from Walter Starhall of the Swiss Federal Institute of Research. I'm sure if our listeners are interested, we can link that video below. But in essence, what he says is, so the circular economy helps preserve resources from an environmental perspective, so water and energy, and it's not constantly being used in manufacturing and extracting goods. You've then got the economic side, which essentially then allows the cost of business to be significantly cheaper. I'll touch on this in a little bit, but essentially the landfill tax, that's going up and up every year, and I will touch on this again, so I won't go into detail now, but it's going to come to a point where it's going to become a bit too much for companies to just be able to warrant themselves throwing away that much money. So, to businesses, it will become significantly cheaper. But then on the social aspect as well, and I guess this also ties in with the economic aspect, is it will help create millions of jobs. And that's because, say you wanted to get rid of your computer, you've got a whole idea that you don't want to throw it away. You'll send it off to be repaired, to be upgraded. Yeah. That'll create jobs for people who are into IT, who need that. That'll create jobs in different businesses. Yeah. That'll also help employ loads of graduates, which I know at the moment is definitely a big issue in light of the pandemic. And I think that's setting a lot of people back.
Yeah, and it does link, doesn't it, to the green recovery and the sort of green revolution, which our current Prime Minister in the UK, at least, is quite heavily promoting. And sort of, some of the buzzwords, if you like, Cameron, around circular economy, we hear a lot about the sort of waste hierarchy, don't we? And I was wondering if you could just explain some of these key definitions for our listeners around the phrases reduce, reuse, recycle, repair, regenerate.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of R words there.
The many R's, yeah.
So if that's all right, if you're able to just kind of just run through some of those and give us a definition before we sort of go back into the sort of the legislation, if you like, that would be good.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the waste hierarchy, I'll touch on that as one of your buzzwords there, Becky. But essentially the waste hierarchy is an upside down triangle. And it starts at the top in the idea of reduce, reduce, reuse, recycle. The idea, obviously, of reduce is just if you're buying or extracting things and you're extracting more than you need and you're cutting it and then just being like, oh, we didn't need that. But, it's like you had a great example, I believe, Becky, from a client. Was it Timber Beams? I think it was.
Yes. Yeah. We do a lot of site visits, don't we, at Crowbury? And one of our clients was what they call them, a glamping pod manufacturer. And they were just ordering in stock sizes of the timber and not really looking at the process in any too much detail. So they were over-ordering timber sizes rather than ordering specifically for the manufacturing process. So they were able to reduce and eliminate, as you say, from the start of that upside down waste hierarchy triangle, they reduce the amount of raw material coming in. Yeah, which
Exactly.
was great from a sort of
Yeah.
cost and a carbon point of view.
It makes a big
So,
difference. Definitely makes a big difference because, it might just be one or two timber beams here and there, but then how many
yeah,
companies are going to be doing that? So obviously the top is reuse and conserving. Then you go down the pyramid, and you then get to the initial use and the idea that manufacturers need to design their products in a much more sustainable way in order to be able to reuse the products. So then obviously you're moving down to reuse when it hits the end of its one life cycle. So if you want a definition of reuse, I guess it's the idea of using an item for either its original purpose or for a different function. So say a toy, a child's toy, if that snaps, it becomes unusable, sending it back to a manufacturer, then, repurposing it or repairing it in order to then sell it back out into the world. And not only does that save on plastic, but it also saves on energy as well.
that's true, and it's just having that mindset, isn't it? I think
Yeah.
about reuse and repair and seeing the value add that you can provide to your customers around your product
Yeah.
ranges as well.
Absolutely.
Like you say, not just discarding it, but actually repurposing. So yeah,
Precisely.
no, it's good that you mentioned that one. And then there's regeneration, which I think is one of the phrases that we had before.
Yeah, I
Can
think
can
that's
you
sort
explain
of
a bit about that?
Of course, yeah. So regeneration and recycle are sort of similar things. They're probably the ones which are less environmentally friendly. A lot of people recycle things and think, "Oh, wow, I'll buy this plastic bottle, but at least I can recycle it." Whereas realistically, it still uses a lot of energy to be able to sort of repurpose that sort of stuff. So regeneration, it's sort of a similar idea of recycling as we all know and love it, but it's more on the idea of base oils, so petrol, diesel, and sort of using, say you've got a generator which is a diesel generator, and that becomes dirty and it becomes oxidated, etc.
Yeah,
You're then able to send that back to a supplier who then goes through a sort of process. Unfortunately, I'm not clued up on that, but there's
that's
a way
okay.
of regenerating the oil, if you will, and taking out
Yeah.
all the contaminants and that only going to waste and reusing the oil. So it's sort of saving on fossil fuels and
Yeah.
stopping it being as harmful to the environment as possible.
Yeah, and I think applying that waste hierarchy and that sort of mindset for any of our listeners who might work in sort of manufacturing sectors is quite helpful, isn't it? Because we're linking back to some of the key legislation that applies in this area, and I know that's your kind of passion, Cameron, is
Yeah.
everything to do with the law. And I just wondered if you could touch a little bit on and explain some of the key UK regulations. Obviously, we've now left the EU with the Brexit. We'll talk about that later, but you might just want to just explain to our listeners, some of the top level UK waste regulations.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, when we were in the EU, a lot of the things which we were legislating on came from EU directives, so that we were at parity. And a lot of there's a big sort of industry in the UK of waste trading with other EU countries. Now, I guess that's not really too great of a thing to have occurred in light of Brexit, but the main legislation, if you will, would be the waste regulations, the hazardous waste regulations, controlled waste regulations,
Oh, okay.
and the electronic and electrical equipment waste regulations, and the producer responsibility packaging waste regulations. So there's a lot of different ones.
Gosh,
And
yeah.
I believe you've done a podcast previously, Becky, which is on waste, and so I'm not sure if you're going to be touching on that in more detail. So I don't want to steal that away from you.
That's okay. I mean, hazardous waste is something that I think some of our listeners might be interested in. What sort of things would be classed as hazardous, Cameron? What sort of things should they be looking out for?
I'd say a big thing with hazardous waste is so printer cartridges, that falls under hazardous waste, and certain things in offices can be classed as hazardous waste. Funnily enough, electrical and electronic equipment is also can be classed as hazardous waste, but they've got their own regulations to sort of deal with that, to discourage those being wasted too much.
Yeah, that's the WEEE, I think.
Yes, WEEE regulations,
which is
sure.
waste electronic equipment, isn't it? Which I think that's been around for quite a while, and I'm sure some of our listeners do recycle their sort of old monitors and computers and things. But certainly, there's a long way to go, isn't there? So in terms of producer responsibility, what sort of connection is there with packaging and essential packaging requirements, linking that to the waste hierarchy? Is there any sort of hints or tips you could give to our listeners on that one, Cameron?
So I think obviously if you are a producer of packaging waste, that falls under anyone. So if you're say you're creating goods, or you work in a shop and you're I don't know, selling cakes. My sister's recently set up a cake shop, so
lovely.
I can use her as a gleaming example. And you sell loads and loads, and you produce over, I believe it's 2 tons of waste in packaging responsibility. Then you fall under the packaging waste regulations, unfortunately. And so you'll notice that you actually have to pay a proportion of the cost of recovery and recycling of your packaging. And that falls under the waste hierarchy. So that's that's the government and the lawmakers trying to apply it in the best way possible in order to be able to stop that stuff going to landfill. So, a carrier bag from the cooperative, from Sainsbury's, all that stuff, to stop them going to landfill, it's these producers have to be able to pay that. So I guess the main way that you do that is to sort of you're going to have to pay that anyway, regardless of your packaging.
That's true.
So the best way to do it is to just make more sustainable packaging. I think that's definitely a big thing that we advise clients, and we do try and provide them with better alternatives. I'm sure you've got some great ones off the top of your head.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? It's again about a mindset change, isn't it? Thinking about packaging, which can be sort of primary, secondary, tertiary packaging. Even a pallet is classed as a form of packaging because you're using it you shrink wrap it and you move your goods and your manufactured product about.
That's a whole new kettle of fish in light of Brexit.
Yeah, so maybe it's interesting.
Episode.
That could be another podcast. So from a sort of producer responsibility point of view, and talking about the design side as well is quite interesting, isn't it? Like getting more people to think about ecological design. Can the packaging be repurposed? Excuse me, can the packaging be, removed or reused again? And I know there's one client we worked with who was sending out very small sort of medical vials with DNA samples in, and they had to be in the cold storage sort of polystyrene boxes. And she would send those out with, on the flip side of the lid, a return to sender address on. So the client would take the vials out of the box, and then obviously you'd be left with an empty box, but obviously it's worth a lot of money, that type of box. So they would just peel the sticker off, stick it on the top, stick it back in the post, and she would reuse them. And I think they were hitting something like a 95% reuse percentage. So saving the client, a lot of money, but also reducing the carbon footprint.
Absolutely.
Because there's embodied carbon, as we know from our previous podcasts that we've done on carbon footprinting. And it is interesting, how the legislation is driving this mindset change. And I know, Cameron, one of the areas that we touched on before was about Brexit. But there is something that came out last year, isn't there? Because we're in 2021 now.
Yes,
we are. Waste. I think I'll say it. If I get it wrong, you tell me if I got it right. The Waste Bracket Circular Economy Bracket Amendment Bracket Regulations 2020. Have I got that right?
Yeah, definitely. So, as you said, we're in 2021 now, so we have officially left the EU. Whether our listeners are happy or sad about that, I won't dwell on it.
Don't go there.
I'd say no, I won't. But I'd say that this is sort of these regulations, and you did get it bang on, by the way. The circular economy regulations, I just like to call them. They're sort of encompassing the direction in which the UK are trying to go in relation to environmental legislation. Michael Gove, when he was the environmental or the head of DEFRA, he essentially released a thing called Our Waste Strategy, a path to a greener future for the UK, something along those lines. We'll link it below. But
we can link it. Yeah.
Essentially, there was this idea of driving a new sort of circular economy sort of agenda.
Yeah.
And obviously, this is the first sort of step in it. It essentially there's no sort of backsliding. I don't think there's going to be any backsliding in relation to Brexit. I can just see that these circular economy regulations are going to drive us forward. They've essentially amended some of the biggest legislations. So the waste regulations, the hazardous waste regulations, and the producer responsibilities for the packaging waste regulations. Yeah. And they've amended these in a variety of ways. So the waste regulations, they've sort of added something what's called waste preventative measures. So this is intended to stop people just binning things when they could just be reused. So
that's good.
Electronic equipment, even though there is definitely a fine for businesses to just throw them in the bin. Yeah, it's important to try and get a hold of a take back scheme and bring that into the fold. There's also, I don't know if any of our listeners or yourself, Becky, have ever been to Germany, or I think IKEA do this now, of all places. But a sort of reverse vending machine, going back and putting your waste back in. And that sort of recycles and repurposes, crushes it down, and it sort of does it all in one, and you get your money back. The government are looking into a sort of take back scheme, in quotation marks.
That's interesting. Yeah.
They're also looking at new economic incentives. So they're trying to look at providing new incentives for companies to comply with the waste hierarchy.
So is this carrot rather than stick?
Yes, I'd say it's more carrot than stick. Yeah.
Okay.
They are stripping. So on that side, there's the carrot, which is economic incentives for applying the waste hierarchy and not disposing, and then you've got the flip side where they're starting to be a bit more harsher, and they're looking at they're looking at the stick side. So they're looking at hurting people for not doing it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
financial
stripping away
penalties.
former landfill tax things for companies who deal with landfill. They're taking away a lot of incentives in relation to that. And so they're looking at more green measures like bio-waste and reuse, and they're looking at stopping incineration of waste. So they're trying to stop that as much as you can. They're also looking at, in relation to what I was saying, with the stick, they're looking at a pay-as-you-throw scheme. So waste producers will be charged for the amount, I believe it's I think it will be even less than a ton. And there'll be a set sort of thing which you will have to pay depending on how much waste you're producing. So that's the waste regulations. The hazardous waste regulations, in relation to what I was saying about regeneration, they've actually put that into legislation for the first time. They've put a definition of what regeneration is, and they're looking at sort of promoting this as a better thing. So for businesses who do use heavy machinery, this is definitely something which you should look into, as it'll definitely reduce your carbon footprint.
And I like your connection back to business there, Cameron, as well, because we do have listeners who are sort of business owners, and maybe we could just touch on some of the common issues that we come across when we're doing our consultancy and auditing of waste and circular economy, because there are some things that we tend to typically see. If you could just maybe summarise and touch on some of those compliance-related issues, that would be great.
So the main things that we come across when we go and do our audits, so we go and do internal audits for our listeners. We go out and do internal audits a lot of the time for our clients who are looking to achieve ISO 2012-1. Sorry.
That's right.
got my yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've never said that wrong ever. You know, it must be the podcast, the stress. It's the so 2012-1, ISO 14001, and ISO 50001, which is
correct. Yeah.
2012 is sustainable events, 50 is energy management, and 14001 is environmental management. A big thing that we come across is in relation to waste transfer notes, which I think a lot of businesses will come across. So you might have a a waste carrier, or someone who comes and collects your waste, and which I hope you do, because I think you'd be breaking the law if you're just dumping. But a big thing that we come across is the filling in of a waste transfer note. So there's two types. There's a waste transfer note, which is just for normal waste, and a consignment note for hazardous waste. Now, a big thing we come across with waste transfer notes is incorrect SIC codes. Unfortunately, I don't know them, a lot of them off the top of my head, but a big thing is people just see the numbers.
What does it stand for, that, Cameron? Just, do we know?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Is it Standard Industry Classification Code, SIC?
I believe so. I believe so, Becky.
Yeah. So it's how you categorise the business, isn't it? So whether it's a hairdresser's or a funeral parlour or a dairy or something like that.
Or just general office waste. Every code has, every sort of industry has a different code, and every type of waste has a different code. So
that's it, yeah.
A big thing is a lot of people see these numbers and just assume that they're correct. Whereas sometimes they do mess up the waste carriers. And that's not always, it's just a mistake. But if you're getting audited by BSI or someone of the sort, you're looking and they spot this and there is a mistake, you're at risk of not getting recertified and it being raised as a non-conformity. So a big thing that you need to look out for is those SIC codes, and getting in touch with your waste carriers and your waste transferers and trying to get them to sort that out for you and reissue a new waste transfer note. I haven't exactly seen any examples of where there's been any backlash from waste carriers. I'm not sure if you have, Becky.
No, most of them are pretty, happy to change if it's the stationery that's out of date or they've not signed off the Part E's.
Oh yeah, that's another one.
Notes.
That's another one that we get into is so the consignment note. There's 5 parts to complete. Part C and E specifically relate to where the waste is going and who's carrying it to that place.
Yeah.
And a big thing that we usually get is because it's hazardous waste, you need to be able to trace that exactly, because if that gets out, that's going to pollute, and that's a big issue. So, a big thing that you need to make sure is there, as not every waste carrier exactly sticks to what gov.uk issue as a sort of standard template. A lot of waste carriers create their own. And a big thing you need to look out for is the issuing of a vehicle registration of what vehicle's taken that waste, because anyone could come pick that up, and if you don't say what vehicle that is, you're at risk automatically
you're at risk
of you being charged, because you are the producer of the waste, so it's you who gets the fine.
It's you that gets the fine. Exactly. And this is interesting, isn't it, for our business listeners and some of our non-business listeners as well, around compliance with waste and waste disposal. And we've talked a lot on this podcast about mindset and changing people's minds and supporting them to a more circular vision, if you like, of a society that is more circular rather than linear. Have you got any thoughts that you want to share about how we can support that change, Cameron? Not just obviously for business owners, but just generally in society as well.
Absolutely. One, listen to the Sustainability Street podcast. I think that's number one on the list. Good. But then I guess following on from that, in the workplace specifically, there's a lot of sort of mindset of just going with the status quo and just sticking with what you know. Yeah. And that we need that to change, because
definitely
it's so important to sort of look more sustainably, as this is everyone's future that we're talking about here. And we need to look at it environmentally, socially, and economically. If you simply just swap and you're willing to do it, great. But the problem is if management want to do it, super. But then the thing is permeating that down throughout the business, because it is top down, not bottom up. So I think a big thing of trying to influence that change is how you get all of the business to follow suit. I've got one left field example, and I think you're going to follow up with a more logical one, Becky. But my one is something called nudge theory. So it's actually a behavioural economics theory developed by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. There's a book on it. It's pretty interesting. And I don't know if our listeners may be aware, but say when you go to the hospital and they say, would you like to be an organ donor? And it used to say opt out. It now says, no, it used to say opt in. It's now opt out. So it's the idea that you make little changes which no one really notices to sort of adjust that status quo. There's loads of academics who have written on this theory to say, it's immoral and it plays on people's, there's a lot of things on that. But in the form of the environment, I think it could do a lot of good.
Okay.
There's a lot of ways you can do it. Energy in the form of energy management. You can look at getting a smart meter installed, an opt out instead of an opt in to getting a smart meter installed. Things like that. But when it comes to waste management, as we're on at the minute, and the circular economy, I think, as I said, the status quo is a big issue. One of the biggest examples of nudge theory is the idea of there being 3 different types. Now, one of them is a less sort of pushy one, where it's sort of forcing an agenda on someone without them being completely cognizant of it. And that's called a first degree nudge. And the idea of that is that you try and change someone's behavior with doing something, but also giving them more information so that they make a more well-informed sort of decision. So for that sort of stuff, employers could just make posters, put it around the office on certain things like that. Another way could be just changing the type of paper you use. Or making sure that every single cartridge of a printer gets replaced with a replacement scheme. And
practical steps.
Exactly, practical steps.
Yeah, interesting.
And that's basically where I'm going with that. But I think you've got another better example, I guess, Becky.
Well, there's lots, isn't there, that we could... I'm just conscious for our listeners here that in our podcast we have got a series of links, and one of them Cameron did talk about before is WRAP.org, WRAP.org. They've worked with lots of sectors over the years on circular economy, resource efficiency, and there's also the Ellen MacArthur Foundation.org, where we have a link as well. And there's something quite recently set up called Circular Economy Club, which again, there's some of those in the UK, lots in London. I know there's one over in Dublin in Ireland. There's one set up in Preston as well. So if our listeners want to find some practical case studies and examples, they can please visit those useful links, which we do include, don't we, Cameron, at the bottom of the podcast. So it's really interesting and very involved, isn't it, this subject matter, Cameron, on waste regulation, circular economy, linking it back to the 3 pillars of sustainability. What are your sort of final thoughts on the subject? Where do you see it going maybe in the next 3 to 5 years, Cameron?
So I can only see it sort of going up in terms of regulation of it legally, but from a sort of moral and social aspect, I'd say that it's all down to people and how everyone wants to buy into it. It's so easy to just sort of throw or litter or just throw something in the bin and not really, because you just can't be bothered. I think the best thing to do is to just sort of try and change your mindset, and that's where my nudge theory idea comes in. You change your mindset, unconsciously, and it may sound a bit silly, but it does work, and it's been proven to work. So I do think that it's certainly something which a lot of people in society just need to buy into.
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you so much, Cameron, for sharing your insights on the very many varied different waste legislations that are out there.
Thanks for having me.